How we doing, everyone? Back for another episode of talking about sports, and for this one, I'm going to talk about the college football playoff rankings that just came out this past Tuesday. A little caught up in some other stuff, so I'm a little late making this, but still pretty close to live reactions. First rankings don't mean too much in a sense, because there's still the whole month of November that has to play out for most teams, but it gives a good insight as to where the playoff committee is currently seeing teams and where they think how good they are up to this point, not based on how they will play out, which really is fun for all the college football fans out there because now we get to project what will happen the rest of the way if so-and-so wins or so-and-so loses. It's almost like an elimination game. Like if Team A and Team B play, it's almost as if Team B will be eliminated if they were to lose. Having said that, I'll go through a couple of topics in this video. It'll be a little bit shorter than some of my previous ones. I'm basically just going to go over the teams that I think are still alive to make the playoff. The most important games remaining in the college football season for the rest of the month, which is pretty much November. The games that I think could create some chaos potentially this week. And also, I'll be covering which conferences are in the most trouble potentially. And what I mean by that is, well, like a conference that is in jeopardy of not seeing someone get in. There's four playoff spots, but there's 5 major conferences, not to mention the independents. Sometimes you get 2 teams from a conference in, like you saw last year of Alabama and Georgia. So sometimes these Power 5 conferences don't get a member in, which really hurts them, not so much in terms of public eye, but it hurts them financially because you get millions and millions and millions of dollars if you do indeed make the playoff. So having said all that, I'm going to start with the teams that I think are still alive to make the playoff entering this first week or week 10 of the college football season. As you might expect, it's pretty much everyone that is in the top 10. For those of you that don't know how it's shaped out, the top 10 went as follows: Alabama at number 1, Clemson number 2, LSU number 3, Notre Dame number 4, so they flip-flop there from the AP poll. Number 5, Michigan. Number 6, Georgia. Number 7, Oklahoma. 8, Washington State. Number 9, Kentucky. Number 10, Ohio State. Yes, I did say Kentucky at number 9, and it's not basketball. It is football. West Virginia, who is currently 13th in the polls. Florida, who is 11th. Central Florida, University of Central Florida, who is 12th. And then also Penn State, who is 14th. Utah is 15th. Iowa is 16th. Those last 4 or 5 that I mentioned, Florida, University of Central Florida, Penn State, Utah, Iowa, I think they're almost on the outside looking in a sense. Mainly, I'll start with Florida because they're in the SEC West, so they need Georgia to lose to Kentucky this week, and then they need Kentucky to lose twice, I believe, because Florida has at least one loss in conference, and they lost the tiebreaker to Georgia, so they will actually need Georgia to lose twice over the next couple of weeks and have Kentucky probably lose twice in order to win the SEC East outright, which is very hard. Central Florida, it's going to be hard for them to make it anyways because they're not a Power 5 school, they're a Group of 5 school, and although this is the highest a Group of 5 school has been ranked in the college football playoffs in the initial one rankings, it's still very, very unlikely that they'll get in because you don't see Group of 5 schools playing in their 3 non-conference games. You don't see them playing in Oklahoma and Alabama and Georgia and beating them. If they did, yeah, they'd be in almost every single time. But they schedule quality opponents, but they're nowhere near scheduling programs like those, mainly because programs like those don't want to play these teams that could potentially beat them, and then, oh, it's a bad loss. Then they're out of the playoff. And, yeah, they just don't care. Who else? Utah is one of 2 Pac-12 teams that is in the current rankings. Washington State was the other one at number 8. So, and I'll get to the Pac-12 a little bit later, but if Utah were to win the Pac-12, maybe they make a run up there late in the season to get into the playoff, but they'd have to be blowing teams out by 20, 30, 40 points and showing that they're really one of the best teams in the country, and I just don't think they are yet. Penn State and Iowa both will need a lot of help. Penn State pretty much needs Ohio State to lose again. And Penn State has lost twice now in the conference this season so far to my knowledge. So definitely lost to Ohio State, and I believe they lost to Michigan State. So they would need to have Ohio State lose 2 more times, and they would need to beat Michigan this week, because that would give Michigan 1 loss already, and then they would need Michigan to lose again. So they need a lot of help, obviously. Iowa, it helps that they're in the West, so they're away from the Ohio States, the Penn States, the Michigans for most of the season, up until the conference championship. However, Northwestern currently has a 2-game lead on them, I believe, in the Big Ten West. So they need a lot of help, and they need Northwestern to falter quite a bit. So really, there's like 11 teams that I see realistically have a very good shot at making it. I know West Virginia's 13th, but if they beat Oklahoma this week and run the table, they're probably going to be Big 12 champs, and that's a conference championship. They'll rise very high in the rankings. So moving along, I'm going to get into the potential chaos imposing games that can happen this week. And what I mean by chaos imposing means it'll really create some controversy for the playoff committee and where to seed teams if a chaos were to happen. What I mean by that, I'll start with the first one, which is if Notre Dame lost this week to Northwestern at Northwestern. Because hypothetically, if Notre Dame loses, but then they run the table the rest of the way, it's hard to leave Notre Dame out. They don't have a conference championship because they're independent, but they beat up on a lot of good teams, and they beat Michigan, who could potentially beat a Big Ten champ. So they could have a win over a conference champion. So that could create a lot of controversy. But if Notre Dame wins out, they're in, without question, because they've played one of the toughest schedules in the country this season, despite, they're not playing Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, Michigan, USC every single week. They have some other, I don't want to call them cupcakes because they're still decent teams. Like Vanderbilt's decent, Wake Forest is decent, but they beat up on those teams, especially since they moved Ian Book to quarterback. Another game that has a potential chaos game this week would be if Penn State were to beat Michigan, which is why I explained earlier of how Penn State could get into the playoff. It would create some controversy because that would just add to the Ohio State-Michigan game, which I'll tell you about in a little bit, and to the Ohio State-Michigan game, because then that team will likely make the Big Ten championship game, but each team then, Michigan or Ohio State, that would make it could potentially have 2 losses already on the season. Or, hypothetically, they would, because Ohio State loses, they get 2 losses to Michigan. Well, 1 to Michigan, 1 to Purdue, but 2 losses on the season. And Michigan would have 2 losses on the year, Notre Dame and then Penn State, who could both end up being in the top 10, which by our standards should not be a bad loss at all. And then the other one, which is probably the most important, is if Alabama were to lose to LSU this weekend in a close game. And you're probably saying, well, if Alabama loses, they're still in. It's true. Like last year, Alabama was not in the SEC championship game, but they still made the playoff. I believe they were the 2nd or 3rd team in the playoff last year, so they were in that one of the 2 matchups. I believe it was the Sugar Bowl that they played in New Orleans. But it's kind of hard to say, how do you leave out Alabama if they have 1 loss, and that 1 loss is to LSU, who makes the SEC championship game, potentially the SEC champion. Because if LSU were to win the SEC championship, they're in. But if that's Alabama's only loss, how do you leave Alabama out if they run the table then and they beat whoever else they have left, Mississippi State, Auburn, and I think the Citadel, which, come on, it's Citadel. They'll win that. But it's like, how do you leave them out then when, 8 games into the season, Tua and the rest of Alabama's offense and defense haven't had to play a 4th quarter. I think last week, or the week before actually, because Alabama was off this past week, I believe 2 weeks ago was the first time Alabama actually had Tua play a snap in the second half, which, given some of the teams that are playing in the SEC aren't, stellar, but those SEC teams would still likely clobber a lot of other teams around the country. So, yeah, that has chaos written all over it, and it's probably the most chaos-imposing game for the entire season, so to speak. That, as of right now, that is. Moving along, I'm going to talk about which games I think are the most important games remaining for the college football playoff. There's 8 of them. You can probably see it online somewhere else on ESPN or Bleacher Report, CBS, NBC, wherever that covers college football. But I'm going to give you my own personal 8 that I think. 4 of them, are actually happening this weekend. One of them is number 6 Georgia against number 9 Kentucky, because winner of that game, like I kind of mentioned earlier, will be the SEC East champion going to the SEC championship game. The next one is West Virginia and Oklahoma, West Virginia and Texas. Because if West Virginia were to lose, it adds even more pressure onto the Oklahoma game, because if West Virginia beats Oklahoma, Oklahoma beat Texas, Texas beat West Virginia. It's a triangle loop and creates for some real controversy, and it essentially would be like the Pac-12, which I'll get to in a bit, of where everyone's just beating up on each other and there's no real team that is superior to the other. So, big game if Texas were to somehow beat West Virginia. Well, all my friends in Morgantown, I hope you don't lose, but just know that if you lose, you could be out, not only out of the playoff, but your conference might not get in either if some other factors play out the rest of the season. Next one is Penn State, Michigan. Touched on it already, because if Penn State wins, it throws a big wrench into Big Ten getting a team in, even if it's a conference champion with 2 losses, because conference champion, would have at least 2 losses. And given where some of the teams are this year, that may not be able to do. Last year was able to do. This year maybe not, because you would have potentially only a 1-loss Alabama or a 1-loss Clemson, which I'll get to in a bit. An undefeated or 1-loss Notre Dame. You'll have an SEC champion that has only 1 loss likely. So it creates a lot of problems. Or a Big 12 champion with only 1 loss. So it creates problems for Big 10. So the Big 10 obviously this week is really rooting for Michigan to beat Penn State, and maybe even beat Penn State handily. They get a team into the top 4 next week, assuming Bama beats LSU. By the way, I do think Bama will beat LSU. I don't know if it'll be by 14.5, which is what the spread is listed as, but I still think they'll win. And if I was in Jersey, I would definitely place a bet on it. But unfortunately, go to school in New York, so I can't officially gamble legally as of right now. That is it for the games this week that I think are the most important. There's only one game next week, Clemson, Boston College, mainly because I think that could potentially be a ACC championship game preview, potentially, because the ACC has, I think, 4 or 5 teams in the top 25 initial rankings. And not to mention, Boston College is no slouch this year. They're pretty good. They've came close with some other teams this year, and if it's almost a trap game, I feel, for Clemson. And I'll mention Clemson a little bit later on. Moving along, the next week, the weekend before Thanksgiving, there's not really anything on the table. A lot of Power 5 schools schedule. They say it's an important opponent and it's very tough and they're preparing for it like it's any other week. But most of the teams schedule a FCS school for that week. It gives most of their players a bye week before the rivalry week happens, which is the weekend after Thanksgiving. I mean, I mentioned before Alabama plays the Citadel. I'm pretty sure there's schools that play like William and Mary or UMass or one of these other FCS schools that probably don't stand a chance with them. So that week's irrelevant. The following week, the week of Thanksgiving, there's also 3 games I feel are very important. One would be Oklahoma and West Virginia. That's when they would be playing. That could almost be not only a de facto Big 12 championship game, but also an elimination game. Loser eliminated from playoff contention if both teams only have 1 loss entering that game. Because then the winner of that game is likely in the top 7 heading into their championship game, and they might get in. Who knows how the rankings will play out. Obviously, Oklahoma has a much easier path to move up than West Virginia would between that time, but we'll see what happens. Another one is Washington State. Mainly because, and I'll mention it again in a bit, Washington State is, the highest ranked Pac-12 team, and they're only one of 2 Pac-12 teams in the initial rankings. So obviously, if they were to lose that game, it throw a wrench in Pac-12 getting a team into the playoff, which I believe they've only had 2. There's been 4 playoffs so far. This is the 5th one about to come up in 2019. And they've only had 2 teams make it. Oregon made the inaugural one and lost in the championship to Ohio State. And then, not last year, so not in the 2017 season, 2018 playoffs, but in the 2016 season, 2017 season, Washington lost to Alabama. It was a close game for the most part, but they lost like 24-7. And that's when they had a lot more talent on the team. Washington was high this year, but they're like they've had 3 or 4 losses already on the year. So that's an important game. And then like how I've kind of mentioned already, Michigan, Ohio State, especially if they're both only have 1 loss, adds to how important that game is because the winner will get the Big Ten East champion and will move on to the Big Ten championship and likely playing for a spot in the college football playoff, so to speak. Moving along, I just want to go over the 5 conferences and the independents, kind of tell you how I feel, which conference I have the least amount of confidence will get a team into the playoff, which one I have the most confidence of one getting in. So starting with the least confident, I think is the Pac-12. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, they only have 2 teams in the top 25 initially, and everyone just seems to beat up on each other every single week. 1 week, Oregon, they're on a 3-game winning streak, and then they lose to Utah. Okay, now Utah's on a 3 or 4 game win streak. They lose to Stanford. Stanford goes on a 3-4 game win streak. They lose to Washington. Washington does the same thing, loses to Cal. So they're all kind of knocking each other out in a sense, and Washington State is really the only team that has been able to solidify themselves as maybe they're the best of the bunch this year in the Pac-12. And the Pac-12 is completely reliant on them. I did mention Utah at the beginning of this video, saying they could get in, but I don't really see that happening, to be honest with you. I think Washington State almost has to run the table, in a sense, and beat Washington, beat all their other opponents, win the Pac-12 championship, and they need some help from the teams above them. Big Ten needs a little bit of chaos to happen. Same with the Big 12. It would certainly help if LSU or Georgia fell off the map a little bit and lost some more games. Those would all really help Washington State getting in, but Pac-12 is completely reliant on Washington State. So if Washington State slips up, they're out because they also already have 1 loss on the year. Second least confidence I have in is the Big 12. And I know Oklahoma is a very, very good team. Lincoln Riley is a very good coach and coordinator. Kyler Murray, who, if things don't work out and he doesn't get drafted where he wants to get drafted in April, he can say the heck with it and go play for the A's since they drafted him this past June in the MLB draft. But, like I said, if Oklahoma were to slip up and lose, does West Virginia have enough with their resume then if they beat Oklahoma to move into the playoff and win the Big 12 championship game? I don't know that they do. I know they only have 1 loss on the year, and I don't recall offhand who that loss was to, but I'm just not convinced that the rest of their resume and the rest of their schedule would be enough to necessarily get them in. They could, but they'd have to run the table, really beat teams handily, and show that they're a very, very good team. They always have offensive firepower. Defense is always, pretty stout, but we'll see. Mainly because, again, if Oklahoma were to slip up before West Virginia and then West Virginia loses to Oklahoma, the best the Big 12 is going to have is 2 losses, and like I mentioned earlier with the Big 10, I don't think a 2-loss team will get in this year. Did last year. A lot of teams were beating each other. I don't think that'll happen this year unless some real chaos were to happen where you see a Purdue beating another Ohio State, so to speak. The one in the middle of the pack, I would say I have the confidence in, is the ACC. And you might be looking at that and saying, well, wait a minute. Washington State has 1 team in the top 10. Clemson is the only ACC team in the top 10. Yeah, they have a bunch of teams at the back, but shouldn't they be more reliant? And you're right. They should be, but here's the thing. Clemson hasn't lost a game yet this season, and they don't have too many bad games left on their resume. They do play Boston College coming up. They do have some other, the ACC is a better conference than people give credit for. You can make the argument it's probably the third best conference behind the Big Ten and the SEC. So, hypothetically, even if they were to lose one game and they still ran the table, as long as that one game wasn't the ACC championship game, I think they could still very much make the playoff as a one-loss team and a conference champion, because the rest of their resume speaks for themselves. They beat a decent Texas A&M team whose two of their three losses are to number 1 and number 2 in the country. So, come on, they're scheduling good. And the rest of the ACC, they've, fairly beaten up on very handily, aside from Syracuse, I believe. And that was because that was right after Kelly Bryant left the team. Trevor Lawrence got injured, so a lot of moving parts. But I'm confident Clemson will win and make it in, but just be careful, because if they slip up before, the championship game or during the championship game, could create some problems if, two SEC teams had shot at getting in, like I mentioned, if Alabama were to lose. Because I do think even a one-loss Alabama deserves to be in. Alabama is the best offense in college football. It's not even close. So second most confident team I'm confident in is the Big Ten, mainly because I mentioned it earlier, in order for them to not make it, you would need Michigan to lose to Penn State, and then you would need Michigan to lose again to Ohio State, and then Ohio State losing the Big Ten championship game to like a Northwestern or an Iowa because, their defense falls apart. Or, if Michigan wins this week and Ohio State has another setback and then Ohio State beats Michigan. I don't think it'll happen. I have a lot of confidence that Michigan is much better than they have been in recent years. And regardless, Michigan and Ohio State will probably be like 5 or 6. Both of them will be maybe 5, 7, or 4 and 6 heading into their rivalry game. So I'm pretty confident that the Big Ten will get one of those two teams in. I don't know which one yet, but I'm confident they'll get one in. Conference I have the most confidence in is the SEC. Pretty self-explanatory. They got 3 teams in the top 6. One of them is going to get in. It's almost a given, unless somehow they all just had a complete doomsday scenario and they all just lost. Alabama loses to Auburn, LSU loses to Bama, Georgia loses to Kentucky, and then Bama loses to Kentucky in a championship, but Kentucky lost once before then. Too many moving parts for the SEC not to get someone in the playoff. I ultimately think they will. I think they could potentially get 2 if LSU beats Bama this week. I don't think they will again, but it could happen. Way to do that, Ant. And then finally, I say, the biggest wild cards for the entire playoff are obviously Alabama. Like I mentioned, if they were to lose one game, do they deserve to get in? I ultimately think they do. And then if Notre Dame, because Notre Dame is an independent, if they run the table and go undefeated, they're in. Hypothetically, though, if they were to lose one game, should they still be in because they don't have that conference championship aspect to speak of? But they still, are Notre Dame. They do have a pretty impressive resume, to say the least, because hypothetically, if Michigan were to get in, like I mentioned earlier in the video, they beat a conference champion already on their regular season. Those are my quick takes on the rankings after this week. In the coming weeks, I'll post probably a little bit shorter videos than this one because of how the rankings shape out and whatnot. I will probably give you some other teams that I think will be eliminated from contention throughout the week. So my list was at, I believe, 11 or 16 total, but 11 serious teams this week. So that list could come down week by week. I'll talk about some other games I feel are important or doomsday games this week, or games I feel that are a trap game, so to speak, and we'll go from there. Be sure to watch my other videos with me and my roommate, Anthony Paventa. I'm looking to have some of my other friends that are much more knowledgeable about the NBA than I am come on and talk about some of the teams that are struggling in the NBA this year or thriving in the NBA, so to speak. And be sure to watch my channel for other videos and Follow me on social media because I post all my videos on there as well. All right. Hope you enjoyed this and have a good day.